I will.
Hello. Hello and welcome everyone to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series. My name is Will Hopkins and I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. In case you're new to New Hampshire Peace Action, our mission is to contribute to creating a world in which nuclear disarmament, mutual security, global understanding, international cooperation, and respect for human rights create social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. If you enjoy our series and are participating through YouTube or Facebook tonight, we'd appreciate it if you would click the like or subscribe button and turn on your post notifications so you'll be able to see new material when it comes along. YouTube will give us a custom link once we get to 50 subscribers, and we are almost there. So even if you're on Zoom, if you look us up on YouTube and subscribe, that would be great. You can also catch any conversations you might have missed on our website. If you happen to have missed last night's conversation, you can email info@nhpeaceaction.org and we can send you a private link, but we've been asked not to share last night's conversation over social media. So 2020 and the pandemic have brought us to a new moment of reckoning and a new moment of possibility. This bi-weekly online conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. Tonight, we are bringing you Kevin Martin, the National President of Peace Action. He's been at the helm for about 20 years, and you might have seen him on MSNBC. You might have heard him on National Public Radio, might have read his work in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Progressive, Z Magazine, or a number of others. You might have seen him on CNN. He has been doing this work since 1985 and has been an important part of guiding all of the Peace Action affiliates around the country for quite some time. Really thrilled to have you here tonight. Kevin, thank you for being here. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to Kevin. Welcome.
Thank you, Will. It's very good to be with folks in New Hampshire virtually, unfortunately not in person. And I especially like coming up there in the winter. There have been a number of times where I've been up to New Hampshire and Maine in the winter. I remember there was one winter that was really wimpy down here in DC, and I was psyched to go. I think it was Massachusetts and then New Hampshire and then Maine. And, there was snow up to here and I loved it. So anyway, it's too bad we can't be in person, but in a lot of ways, doing these virtual things actually can allow for more participation. They're not on, so I guess I'm not going to embarrass them, but I wanted to say thank you for John Lamperti, who's been a long time supporter, obviously, and has been on the national board for a long time. Johnny LeBombard, who's been a very generous supporter of national, and everybody who supports National Peace Action, as well as the New Hampshire affiliate. And especially thankful for Doreen and Will. And I hadn't thought of this for a while, but I was actually on the hiring committee in, I guess, 2008 or 2007. So Will was actually one of the people that I consulted or helped with the interview process. And I remember being very impressed and being very pleased when Will was selected. And obviously it was a really great decision to have him at the helm now since 2008. Does that sound right? Will, is that right?
2009, September 2009
okay.
is when I stepped in.
All right, very good. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is kind of two parts of a conversation. The first will be kind of a snapshot of a legislative update of a very sort of bullet points list of important legislation that Peace Action is advocating and supporting right now. Excuse me. And I'll stop then after going through that fairly quickly, and we'll have some Q&A about those pieces of legislation. And then I want to have a more sort of focused, in-depth discussion about a campaign that has already started, but I'm hoping will gain even more momentum around nuclear disarmament, particularly the issue of the new ICBMs, the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is a stupid bureaucratic name, and we have to give it a better name. So Will's going to do a screen share, and we're going to do, again, the first part where it's legislative and policy issues that we're tracking right now. And we'll do some Q&A after that. And then we'll get into the more in-depth discussion about working on this campaign regarding getting rid of the ground-based strategic deterrent, the new ICBM boondoggle that the United States is pursuing.
Sorry, it would help if I could figure out the correct screen to share.
Seems
There
like
it
you had
is.
it, but then it went off again.
Oh, that wasn't it. That was a different document. Okay.
There we go.
And nope, that's also not it.
Well, I'm seeing the right one.
You are? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. As long as you're seeing the right one.
Okay. Are other people saying? It says peace is not an awful lot to ask, but we need to strengthen our demand. That was the title that I came up with. Do other people see that?
I do.
Okay. All right, very good. We're not, you don't see Will's grocery list or some other thing that he was sharing by mistake. Okay. So the first thing, this is a pretty general ask, but a very important one on the Pentagon budget. We don't know the exact timing of when the overall budget will be introduced by the Biden administration, not just the Pentagon budget, but the whole federal budget. But we are looking at the possibility, and I wouldn't bet a lot of money on this necessarily, but especially with Bernie Sanders on the Senate side as the chair of the Budget Committee, that there could be an overall lower Pentagon budget number to start with. So we'll keep people updated as far as we know when the budget will be introduced. I don't have a date for you yet. It could be at least a few weeks yet. So the action, and anybody can do this, but particularly if you have a connection or a good relationship with any of your representatives or senators, either individually or their key staff people, their legislative director or their chief of staff, asking that they directly contact the Biden administration, advocating an overall lower Pentagon budget number. Now, later we'll get into cutting money for this program and that program, obviously. But again, this is the overall top line, as they call it, budget number for the Pentagon. And every congressional office, usually it's going to be the chief of staff, but somebody will have the responsibility of being the liaison with the administration. And of course, there are pros and cons to what Biden and the administration have been doing so far. They've done some good things on our issues. They've done some not so great things on our issues. But this is a little bit of a change, having at least the opportunity to weigh in with the administration, which we really didn't have for 4 years under Trump. So this is a muscle that we're getting to flex again, that even though they're not going to do everything we want, we will have some access to the Biden administration. On diplomacy with Iran, speak of the bad things, and to me it just said so much about what's wrong with our country. A lot of good messages were put out after the airstrike on the supposedly, it's somewhat controversial, supposedly Iranian-backed militia in Syria. At the same time that the minimum wage increase got stalled because of the parliamentarians' ruling, and a lot of people were saying it should be easier to raise the minimum wage than to bomb Syria. I mean, it just said so much about what's wrong with this country. The dubious legality is what I put in there, and that's maybe understating it. I think it's not legal. Congress hadn't authorized anything like that. And to claim that it was authorized under the 2001 or 2002 authorizations for the use of military forces is ludicrous. What, of course, the Biden administration needs to be doing instead is focusing on diplomacy. And I'm a bit concerned that they haven't done this already. So last week, there was good news that the administration said they were going to re-enter into talks to join the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed, of course, under the Obama and Biden administration, and Trump pulled us out or put the US in violation of it. But I heard just today that Iran is actually has declined to join in the initial talks that were being proposed by the European Union. Remember, this was not just a bilateral agreement between the US and Iran. It's the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. So it is a multilateral deal. So we'll have to see where that goes. And I was hopeful that this was going to be something that they would get done very quickly. I think there are reasons that they have stalled that I don't think are legitimate ones, but I could try to explain those if you wanted me to. The focus has to be on getting the United States back into the JCPOA. I actually think we should be going much farther, sanctions relief, and actually working with Iran on some of the common interests that we have in the region. And of course, the Iranian people are probably the most Western, pro-Western people in the region. The United States and Iran should be friends. We shouldn't be, antagonists. The action for now is to contact your reps and senators to support the Iran Diplomacy Act, which is about to be introduced. Now, as I go through all these different bills, there is not a current bill number because they haven't been reintroduced in this session of Congress, but there should be this week. These all should be being introduced this week. And so if you go to that link, it shows last year's bill. It should be very similar. Ed Markey, I believe, again, is going to be the lead sponsor on it. I think he already has 10 co-sponsors, but there'll be more on that soon. And either Will should have it, or when we put out an action alert, I think actually we're going to put out an action alert on this tomorrow. If you're not on the Peace Action National Action Alert list, you can sign up through our website, or you can ask Will how to do that, or Will may end up sending it out himself too, I don't know. But we do want a strong showing of both representatives and senators to tell the Biden administration that we must emphasize diplomacy and get back into the JCPOA. On the next issue on police militarization, I actually saw something just in the last half hour that this might have been voted on in the House today, or if not, maybe voted tomorrow. And I tried to do a quick check just before I got on. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, again, the link is from last year, but it was not only has been reintroduced, it could have been voted on within the last hour or so, and if not, will be tomorrow. It's going to pass in the House, so the question will be, will it also pass in the Senate? And then there will be at least one other bill on the Pentagon's 1033 program, the horrible program of transferring military weapons to local police forces. Hank Johnson of Georgia has been a leader on that issue for years. That'll be at least one other piece of legislation we'll be supporting, and that'll come up soon. On North Korea, two pieces of legislation that are going to be reintroduced again very soon. The Enhancing North Korea Humanitarian Assistance Act, Andy Levin on the House side and Ed Markey on the Senate side, will be introduced tomorrow. So that will be something that we want you guys to get on, your senators and representatives, to support that. And then also very soon, Ro Khanna's resolution in the House calling for a formal end to the Korean War. It was called HRES 152. It may or may not get the same bill number. Between when they have to reintroduce something in a new Congress, sometimes they're able to get the same bill number and sometimes they're not. But that should be introduced very soon too. We never did have a Senate companion bill last year, but we're hoping we will this year. Will, if you can scroll down a little bit, please. I'm going through these quickly, but then I'll stop at the end of them and then you can ask any questions you like. So on nuclear disarmament issues, there's certainly going to be a lot that we're advocating. One of the good things that Biden did was extending the New START agreement with Russia for 5 years. There'll certainly be things that we're promoting in terms of no first use, in terms of ending the sole authority for a president to wage nuclear war. On the educational front, we'll be supporting various parts of the Back from the Brink campaign. And there's a link to a webinar that Paul Martin, my colleague, will be on this Thursday at 11. There'll be other issues we're looking at, including, of course, supporting the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which went into force in January, just right, I think the day after Biden was inaugurated. But one of the big things that we're going to be looking at is cutting funding and working to stop the new ICBM, the bureaucratically named Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, GBSD. I think we need to give it a different name. The one I threw out there is the Omnicider, because it risks killing all life on Earth, but somebody else might come up with a better one. So those are really quickly and this is just a snapshot. This is not meant to be comprehensive of all the issues we're working on or issues that may come up later in the year. These are the ones that we're looking at right now, that if you are so moved, you can take action to support any of those pieces of legislation. So I want to stop there and see if there are questions or comments about that, and then we'll move into the second part, which is more of a campaign-focused discussion around this new ICBM, the GBSD, as they call it.
So folks can feel free to enter any questions in the chat, or you could put an asterisk in the chat if you would like to ask your question yourself. And I put all of the links from that section in the chat as we went, so you should be able to find those there. If you're having trouble figuring out how to use the chat with the screen share, if you hover your mouse around the bottom center of your screen, it should pop right up. Kevin, I have a question. Were folks like Trita Parsi at the National Iranian Americans Council and folks in the circles you run in expecting Iran to decline this round of negotiations? My understanding from our affiliates calls and emails were that that Iran was willing to come back into the JCPOA. Was this a surprise to folks?
This only came out today, and I just saw an email about it sort of later this afternoon and haven't really delved into it. My concern is that this is because of the airstrike last week, or that airstrike last week was potentially used as an excuse. I think it's foolish to get, this endless cycle of violence of tit for tat airstrikes, and what Trump did in terms of retaliating for a strike, and he killed Soleimani, the Iranian general. I think we've been fortunate that we haven't had an accidental escalation. Besides these different airstrikes, and this is not to make excuses for the militia that may or may not be backed by Iran that are in Syria and Iraq. I mean, they are certainly pursuing their own ends using violent means. So I'm not, defending them, but I think the United States, being the much bigger power, first of all, why in the world are our troops still there? And especially when there really isn't any legal justification. But the problem is, the longer that this goes on, and whether it has to do with Biden. See, the thing about Biden and his administration and the people that are, he's putting into diplomatic positions, they all know everything they need to know about the JCPOA because they negotiated it, right? It was their administration just 5 years ago. So it's not like this is an issue that's new to them. It's not like some novice president who doesn't understand what this agreement is about or anything like that, right? There's concerns that maybe either domestic political pressure or pressure from Saudi Arabia and Israel, because they don't want us to go back into the deal, that those could be factors, but none of that is excusable. They understand what is about this deal and what the United States needs to do and how it's in United States interests and in the interests of the region. The other problem then is we have to understand, even though we don't have any control over it, Iranian domestic politics. The next presidential election is in June, I think, in Iran. And the fact that Rouhani, who has been, the president and had a green light to pursue diplomacy as sort of a moderate, there's no guarantee at all that the next president will be either of the same political persuasion or be allowed by the higher ups who really, call the shots to pursue diplomacy. And if you wanted to be hard line in Iran, you could say, Trump pulled out of the deal that we were complying with. We've had these punishing economic sanctions. We're dealing with COVID-19. We need relief from sanctions. We need the US to go back into this deal. And if that doesn't happen soon, you might see the Iranian leadership turn very hard line on this and say, we don't necessarily want to go back into the deal. I don't think they want to necessarily go full speed ahead and develop nuclear weapons. But if we can't get the deal put back together again, they probably want to be on the nuclear threshold or close to having nuclear weapons. And I don't want anybody to have nuclear weapons, but you can sort of understand why they feel that way if they feel betrayed by the United States. And again, Iranian domestic politics could take an ugly turn that would not favor, getting back into the deal. So that's why I think time is of the essence, and this needs to be done very quickly.
Thanks. Question from Brenda. She says, wait, I'm embarrassed to ask this, but the request to end the Korean War that Ro Khanna is introducing, as in the 1950s one? So
Yes,
little,
believe it or not. So it's quite an unusual situation that the end of the Korean War, so to speak, was an armistice that was supposed to have been temporary. It was supposed to have been a temporary armistice to have been replaced by an actual peace treaty. Well, that's never happened. So the armistice goes back to what, 1953? Is that right? I think. So it's unfinished business, and it's not just some diplomatic technicality or whatever. If it were, they would have done it a long time ago. The North Koreans understandably feel that they are under severe military, political, economic pressure from the United States, and they feel like their main beef is with the United States, which is understandable. There have been remarkable strides made in terms of inter-Korean diplomacy. President Moon of South Korea deserves most of the credit for that. But right now, I think North Korea is taking a wait and see policy. And I'm concerned here again that the Biden administration may not make this a priority. They're doing a policy review right now. I was on a couple of webinars last week about Korea, and nobody thinks that the Biden administration is going to put this on the fast track. Now, we're part of a campaign, and Peace Action helps lead something called Korea Peace Network, and we work with a lot of Korean American organizations and also with some South Korean civil society groups. So we take a lot of leadership from them. We're all working to oppose the US-South Korea military drills, which do seem like they are being scaled back, although they haven't done a big announcement about that. But then these bills, and there will probably be a few others on, so Ro Khanna's one is advocating a peace agreement, but then the Humanitarian Assistance Act, also ending the travel ban. It's heartbreaking. There are South Koreans and Korean Americans in this country whose families have been divided since 1953. People going to their graves without ever getting to see their siblings or their parents or their grandchildren. It's heartbreaking. And there's no reason for that. And the Trump administration, despite the bizarre bromance that ended up really in producing almost nothing between him and Kim Jong-un, they made it much more difficult in terms of sanctions and even the humanitarian exceptions. So colleagues of ours that have had humanitarian operations in North Korea weren't able to get in there to help with some of the things that they've been doing for a long time in terms of agriculture, in terms of medicines and aid, and of course now with COVID-19. So there are a lot of humanitarian issues. Also the remains, there's still remains of US soldiers who died in Korea that haven't been returned. So there's a pretty big agenda that needs to happen. For me, I think the most important thing is some kind of a peace agreement. But again, you can make progress on the humanitarian issues even before you have a peace agreement.
And next question from Chris Hansen. Chris, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. It seems so much of the discussion about our relationships with Iran and the conflicts in that part of the world all attempt to paint Iran as the enemy, or they're certainly painting them in a bad light, and making the sort of covering up the significant rivalry of Iran and Saudi Arabia as a bigger factor than just about anything I can see anyway. And is there something that we can do, in our work, in our how we verbalize all this, to make it clear that the culprits are not necessarily as they're identified in the press so widely, and maybe just remove some of those signifiers from the discussion, so that when we hear about an attack in Syria, it's not against the Iranian sponsored whoever, It's just against who the attack was against, and that it's made clear that what we're doing is aiding the Saudi Arabian faction in their efforts to destabilize or to delegitimize Iran.
You're absolutely right. And there is this, what I think, very cynical alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And under the Trump administration, and I think this was a very accurate description, that U.S. Middle East policy was basically subcontracted out to Saudi Arabia and Israel. And if you certainly look at the horror of the slaughter in Yemen, that has the Saudi-backed former government and the Houthis, who are somewhat backed by Iran, but are much more independent and legitimate than most people think. The Houthis have actually been in that region for 1,300 years and have legitimate grievances that they've been oppressed and not allowed to have their own government, et cetera, for a long, long time. So that conflict is more complicated than people make it out to be. And the United States absolutely has to stop funding and supporting Saudi Arabia and the UAE in terms of their horrible slaughter in Yemen. So I think you do have to understand those regional dynamics, but we also don't have to be prisoner to them to say this is in U.S. interest, this is in the interest of the Iranian people, this is the interest of the people in the region. Again, I'm hopeful that going forward that you could actually have, because I don't accept that the United States and Iran have to be in this intractable conflict that's basically been since 1979 when the Shah took over. And of course, that was after the United States supporting one of the most repressive human rights abusing governments, when we supported the Shah, I'm sorry, for all those decades before Khomeini came in 79. I just don't think that we have to be prisoner to that. The problem with a lot of American foreign policy is just how reductionist it is. Like North Korea, it's not that there are actually 25 million people that live there. There's this crazy guy, Kim Jong-un. And the same thing in Iran. It's not like there are 80 million human beings there. There's just the Ayatollahs who hate us and we hate them and they're crazy, right? So you get tired of, do these countries ever get let out of the penalty box? Do they ever get to be human beings, or are they just reduced, to caricatures? So I think anything we can do to help to deconstruct that larger framework or context. But again, you don't have to do all that to say it's in the interest to emphasize diplomacy and for the United States to get back into the deal and get Iran back into the deal. I'm just afraid that we may blow it, that we may run out of time because of the factors I was talking about before.
Thanks, Kevin. Next question's from Michael Hoey. It seems that some of the largest warfare threats are in the cyber arena. Is it probable that someone like Israel is developing another Stuxnet?
Probably yes. And going forward, this is something, and we can talk about this in the next section. And I certainly don't claim to be an expert about this, but there have been overtures from other countries to say we should have some kind of a cyber warfare treaty, and I think that would make a lot of sense. Even if you want to make a conservative case, which is not my job to do, but if you want to make a conservative case about cutting spending for nuclear weapons or for foreign bases, or for, the Navy wants to have 500 ships or 600 ships, or I don't know how many, there's never enough ships for the Navy, right? That you could make a conservative case in cutting the Pentagon budget on some of those issues and programs, that you do need to focus more on emerging threats, and cyber warfare is one of that. So it's possible that down the road, we might be able to make common cause with some conservatives who agree that you shouldn't be spending all this money on aircraft carriers and bases and nuclear weapons, and we need to address cyber threats. But the way to do that is some kind of a treaty. And I believe that China and Russia might be amenable to something like that. On the other hand, they might not, because they might see it as an equalizer for them, because there's no way they can match us on spending on any other forces, conventional forces, nuclear forces, or whatever. They can never match us. So we'll have to see. But that's certainly an issue that is emerging and that we have to keep an eye on for sure.
All right, I'm going to go back up to get Brenda's second question, since we've got I think we've got some time. So the question is, isn't this Syrian conflict what HRC was planning? I'm assuming that's Hillary Rodham Clinton, to do with Avril in there, and I'm not sure if that's a typo, or I'm not sure who Avril is.
Could be Avril Haines, who
Okay.
is now up for, I forget what position she's being put up for in the intelligence community. Yeah.
Got it. So it's the question is, if I'm reading it right, is this about the pipeline and a conflict with Russia in Syria?
That's certainly one of the factors that you have to look at. And you don't have to be a fan of the Syrian government to say that they, have been able to hold on this horrible civil war, uncivil war, and of course, not just civil, because you've had outside forces in Syria, has been this just gigantic humanitarian catastrophe. But for better or worse, the Syrian government has held on. They have maintained control of most of the country against some forces, including ISIS, which a lot of people say was created by the United States. ISIS didn't exist in the region, in the country, until the United States invaded Iraq. So the other thing that points out is the sort of holdover or coming back into power of some of the same people that were in the Biden administration, or excuse me, in the Obama administration, coming back into the Biden administration. And you see that a lot with Republican and Democratic administrations. If they're out of power for 4 or 8 years, a lot of the same people come back in, and sometimes they bring the same attitudes or the same policies or the same predilections that they had before. The thing about that, though, is in terms of the danger of US forces being in the region, the main way you solve that is by getting them out of there. We need to get all of our troops out of the region. That's what the solution is, and especially this is going to be an issue coming up in Afghanistan very soon, sooner rather than later. Whether the Taliban will accept anything, in terms of negotiations to help stabilize the country, other than the United States getting out. And of course, the United States has said we're going to get out. There's a question of, are we going to get completely out, and on what timeline? So I think, trying to understand these forces in the region and also behind U.S. policy are good, but it's also, just clear cut to say U.S. forces don't belong there and need to get out of there and be brought home.
All right. And next question from Ginny Schneider. Ginny asks, my understanding is that the U.S. has been the aggressor regarding cyber warfare. Is this correct? And if so, are other countries engaging it from a defensive perspective?
This is one of these things that it's very hard to know for sure. And I don't claim to be an expert on this issue. The United States is usually the leader in most all technologies of warfare, so it wouldn't be a surprise if that were the case. But I don't claim to know the genesis of it.
That is all the questions we've got in the chat. If you want to move on to the second part of your talk.
Great. So what this is meant to be is kind of a more a discussion with you guys, and to get your feedback and your interest in participating in a campaign. So as I said, there are going to be a lot of different issues regarding nuclear weapons. No first use, ending the sole authority of a president, any president, to launch a nuclear war. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that happens every 5 years was supposed to have been last year. It was postponed twice already because of the coronavirus crisis. They're right now rescheduling it for the beginning of August in New York, but we don't know if that's going to happen, and I'm actually kind of skeptical. And then, of course, there's the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force earlier this year, which is something to celebrate, particularly in terms of international civil society having been at the table and have helped to create that treaty. I was in New York in 2017 when the countries were negotiating. Peace Action and other NGOs can have delegates for those kinds of conferences, and it was great to see countries getting together and creating that treaty. Of course, the United States and the other 8 nuclear powers are not going to sign on anytime soon, but it is something we can point to in terms of a growing international campaign and legitimacy to delegitimize, I guess, nuclear weapons. But one of the things that we think in the realm of the whole nuclear quote unquote modernization, Obama, for the relatively modest New START agreement with Russia, was, coerced, if you want to think of that, to agree to this boondoggle of nuclear weapons modernization. And what it really means is upgrading our whole nuclear weapons complex. And the price tag right now is supposedly $1.7 trillion over 30 years, but it could be way more than that, because we know, tell me one weapon system that ever came in under budget. It doesn't exist, right? So it could be a lot more. So one of the worst boondoggles, and one of the ones that we think may be most vulnerable that we could get some success on, and I think there's some strategic reasoning behind this, is the new ICBM, the new missile for carrying nuclear warheads, the ground-based strategic deterrent. And the people have been trying to play with that acronym and call it what was it? Somebody came up with something, I don't know, giant boondoggle, I forget what the rest of it was, but I came up with something called the Omnicider. So they'll come up with some name at some point, like the Atlas or the Titan, or the MX, the Missile Experimental. They never got around to. Oh no, that was the Peacekeeper, right? That was the worst one, because they called it that was Orwellian. They called it the Peacekeeper. The first sort of down payment on it is 100 billion, but over the life cycle of it, it's 264 billion, and of course that'll be a lot more. Now, one of the reasons that I think it makes sense, and I'm for getting rid of all nuclear weapons by midnight tonight, obviously, and I'm sure all of you are too. But one of the reasons that I think that this makes a lot of sense is the cost, but also the vulnerability, or the fact that it makes a nuclear sponge. In other words, it's actually intended to draw nuclear strikes from Russia or China, or whoever, in the heartland of the country as opposed to the coast. Not that they wouldn't hit DC, of course. The states that are directly impacted, Wyoming and Nebraska and Colorado, North Dakota and Montana, are the 5 states that actually have the missile silos. California is where they do the missile flight testing from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And I should have actually added New Mexico, because Los Alamos, I believe, will be where the warheads are manufactured. And then also Utah, where the Northrop Grumman, who's the main contractor, has built a new headquarters there. And they also will test the solid fuel, the rocket fuel, the solid fuel system. So there's a lot of states there. And then, of course, all the surrounding states. But we're all downwinders if there's a nuclear war. I do think, though, that there is some value to people in that region taking responsibility to say, we don't want this, we don't want to be targets. I live in Wyoming. There's no reason that any country would want to nuke Wyoming except for these missiles that are right here. And that makes me a target, makes my family a target, makes my family less safe. So I think we can have a regional campaign, and Peace Action has contacts with grassroots groups in pretty much all those states, not all, but most of them. And of course, there are a bunch of national organizations as well working on this. And this leg of the triad is thought to be sort of the most vulnerable and the most dangerous. If there were to be a nuclear war, and again, we want to get rid of them all, but if there were to be a nuclear war, they're the sitting ducks. They're the ones that everybody knows where they are and can be targeted. Whereas the strategic bombers can get in the air and presumably evade radar, and they can also be recalled. If it was a false alarm, you can bring them back. If you launch a missile, that's it. You can't bring them back. And the submarines, of course, which are thought to be invulnerable at sea, and the enemy doesn't know where they are. So there's links there for an article that I did that was in Common Dreams last week that was sort of a brief start at talking about the issue. And then the longer one, which is fantastic, I highly recommend, in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists by Elizabeth Eves. And there's also a link to her article in mine as well. So we would be looking at education and agitation, webinars, actionars, where you ask people to take action, social media, legislative pressure on Congress and administration. And there will be a bill, I think I mentioned it before, there will be a bill probably out this week. And it could be that Senator Warren is taking the lead on this, or it could be Markey, I'm not sure, on cutting funding for this new missile program. So we will have that to lobby for Congress and the administration. Traditional media outreach, there's already been some pretty good media around this in some conservative outlets in that region. These are, for the most part, pretty conservative states. Protests at missile sites and also at Northrop Grumman facilities, and of course, analysis that we connect this to larger issues for nuclear disarmament. So this is something that I think will gather some momentum and some traction. Actually, Jeremy and I talked about this a little bit last week, but I'd be curious to hear your questions or concerns about making this a priority. And again, even though I'm talking a little bit about how we work with grassroots groups on the ground in that region, it would certainly be a national campaign, because this is federal policy to replace these missiles. And even just think of that 100 billion. If you instead put that into oomping up our vaccine production, or any other thing, any other possible thing, education, housing, green economy, creating jobs, healthcare, whatever it is a better use than new nuclear missiles. So love to hear what you think of this idea, this campaign, and if there are ideas you have or ways you think you could contribute.
So again, feel free to enter questions in the chat or put an asterisk if you'd like to be recognized to ask a question yourself. I'll go ahead and ask, how are we, as we look at a campaign to try to bump down that $1.7 trillion number for the nuclear weapons upgrades, how are we dealing with Democratic senators and House members who are viewing it as a source of kind of military Keynesianism, where they're bringing jobs home? And this describes certainly New Hampshire's 4 representatives who tend to, if they think that they can get some jobs out of something, are not going to listen to people like us. So what is our what's our tactic with those folks who are looking at nuclear weapons upgrades and redevelopment as a source of jobs that can be won in Washington?
Well, that's very tough. That's one of the hardest issues we have, to tell you the truth. There's a picture in this Bulletin of Atomic Scientists article of the groundbreaking for this new Northrop Grumman headquarters in Utah, and both Republican senators were there with shovels, Mitt Romney and Mike Lee. And it's interesting because among the Republicans, I know you asked about Democrats, but among the Republicans, if this weren't a program in Utah, those might be 2 that we might think, might possibly swing to our side. But that is certainly going to be true of Democrats too. John Tester in Montana is certainly going to be, and they even have the missile caucus. When there was talk in both previous administrations, there's been at least talk about scrapping this ICBM leg of the triad. And the senators from that area got so concerned, they decided to have something called the Missile Caucus. So I think it's fair to say head on, first of all, how much are you getting paid by Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Boeing, et cetera, and look at their campaign contributions, right? Look at how much lobbying they may be doing. But also to involve people in the communities, because we just can't afford this, especially if you look at the 1.7 trillion. That is not something we can afford when so many other needs are going begging in terms of investment in our future. And I think as I've been talking to people, particularly in the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, what they're going to need to do is engage local communities and say, well, we think it's important to get rid of these missiles for our security and for global security, but we still would like federal dollars coming into our communities. So one of the ones that sort of surprised me, and it's in that article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, is Great Falls, Montana has a symphony. Cities the size of Great Falls, Montana don't normally have symphonies, right? But it is because of the federal largesse that goes into the missile program, the Minuteman III now, and what would be the new missiles in Montana. So I think involving local communities and saying, well, we don't want missiles anymore, and here's what we need instead. We need more hospitals, we need better schools, we need more teachers, et cetera. And you can point to studies going back 30 or 40 years. The most recent one from the University of Massachusetts was probably 5 or 6 years ago, looking at the economic impact. You take a given amount of money from the federal government, you put it into anything else other than military spending, the anything else creates more jobs. And the best thing to put it into is education. Education creates 2.5 times more jobs than military spending. Now, that doesn't mean that Mitt Romney and John Tester and your senators there are going to see the light because you put a study in front of them. It will take pressure, and I think it will take people in communities saying this is what we want instead in our communities. And that leads to building relationships with human needs groups, et cetera. And I've already had some interest from the Rotary Club, which of the mainstream service clubs, they're the one that has long been committed to peace. And they're also doing work on climate that's very good. And so, we might have some mainstream allies like that. If we get the Rotary Club, as well as the Council of Churches and the unions, et cetera. Unions are hard too, because for a lot of them, these are, the airspace workers, they are union jobs.
Yeah, that's right. So next question from Ginny Schneider. Now that the Kochs and Soros are funding the Quincy Institute, are there opportunities to work across the aisle on these issues? Are we seeing
Quincy Institute is doing some good work, but I haven't seen them pulling any Republicans over to our side yet. We'll see.
Okay, we had a few good links in there from Jeremy, and also a good way to talk to our if we're talking to our reps, if you see them in your hometown or at campaign events, $67,000 per minute was what we spent in 2019 on nuclear weapons. So, thanks, Jeremy, for putting that in the chat.
Yeah, and the the link that I put below that is the actual report, so it details out all of the other spending that countries have been putting towards or appropriating for that cause. And also shout out to Alicia Zachary Sanders, who is one of the main authors of this report, and she's a former intern, I think, with New Hampshire Peace Action. Is that correct, or was it AFSC?
It was. No, she interned with New Hampshire Peace Action back in 2007.
Yeah, and now she's a heavy mover and shaker in the nuclear abolition movement, which really just kind of makes me proud for Concord.
That's great.
Great. So there were a few things while you were talking, Kevin, that came to my mind. We have another thing in the chat to note. 3,500 is the number of warheads. Jeremy, is that the number of warheads that are included in the upgrades?
Well, I mean, I believe that that's what the current, let's say announced figure of like what the total U.S. arsenal is. So I was just, Ginny had asked about there being 3,500 in total at Kirkland Air Force Base, and that I believe that more closely approximates what the total warhead count is.
Well, and I think if you include the ones that are either being dismantled or waiting to be dismantled or are extras or whatever, the whole US total is about 9,000.
Oh, wow.
We don't normally use that number because it's harder to explain. Under the New START agreement, it's 1,550 each side that are allowed to be deployed. So that's the sort of more common figure. But again, when you're talking about these numbers, of those 1,550, they're almost all tens or hundreds of times, or some thousands of times more explosive than the Hiroshima bomb. And that's another issue that I didn't get into, but that we think we have a chance to work on, is the so-called low yield nuclear warhead that Trump was really big on pushing because it's potentially more usable in a nuclear war, which of course we think is a horrible idea. That'll be another one that we think we have a chance to make some progress on. And again, you can make the arguments that we can't afford this in terms of other military priorities. Again, that's not my my rap. But if you're conservative and you can say, well, we can't afford to spend all this money on this nuclear weapons upgrade because we have to spend on other quote unquote defense priorities. What I think we need to say is no, we need to invest in more life affirming and environmentally affirming priorities. And then you can also get into questions about deficit spending. You know, the Republicans all of a sudden have rediscovered that they care about deficits, which they didn't under Trump, obviously. And you can get into modern monetary theory, which is actually very easy to explain, even though it sounds arcane. So it doesn't have to be a tit for tat or a one-to-one. It's more, why are we putting this as a priority? Why are our scientists, our engineers, our graduate students, et cetera, being put to work on this boondoggle that's meant to end life on Earth instead of more human priorities and environmental priorities?
Thanks, Kevin. Chris, you want to ask a question?
Yes, thanks. One of the other bad ideas that Trump floated was the idea of a space force. And I kind of rolled my eyes, and I hope
can't help laughing. I can't.
Yeah, I'm glad you did, but I think a lot of people did. But I'm wondering if that still has any legs and any life, and is that something that we should be hoping to exterminate as at the very start of the Biden administration?
So I think right now the good news is that they set up this sort of superstructure for it, but it's not clear that it will actually be funded as an actual co-equal branch, compared to the Air Force and the Marines and the Army. So there is that sort of placeholder bureaucracy there, but I think it's actually entirely possible that it will not become what Trump and others have thought in terms of a full branch of the military. I certainly hope so. I hope not. And we'll keep an eye on that and do whatever we can to delete it, defund it, etc.
All right. Well, I'm not going to make all the jokes that I want to make, but I'm restraining myself. Next question is from Amy Antonucci. Is peace action making connections with Indigenous people, especially out west, who are also working on nuclear issues?
Yes, and particularly our local groups in that area, the local peace action groups. And there's also a terrific organization called MACE, M-A-S-E, that Susan Gordon, who's a former peace action person, works for, that works specifically with tribes there on water issues primarily, but it connects a lot to nuclear issues. That will definitely come up in New Mexico, probably in Utah. There's been an ongoing lawsuit by a tribe in Utah, the Paiute, I believe, against using that land for the rocket fuel testing systems. It will probably come up in Nebraska, Colorado. So I think in those states there are a lot of those connections that are already existing, of groups that work in coalition, and a lot of that has been ongoing around the nuclear weapons production complex, and of course the Nevada test site itself on Western Shoshone land. It's not used anymore for nuclear explosive testing, but yeah, and of course the nuclear colonialism, the nuclear imperialism is not just in the United States. It's true of pretty much all the other nuclear powers as well, that they have appropriated Indigenous peoples' lands for producing and deploying nuclear weapons. So it's and then also just look at our horrors of nuclear testing in the South Pacific, the Marshall Islands, the problems that the Marshallese still have. So it's the nuclear racism, the nuclear colonialism, which has endured for so long, is still an issue that people are struggling against, for sure.
That is all the questions in the chat right now. Is there anything else? We are nearing the end of our time. We probably have time for one more question. And there it is. Somebody has put in that question. It's a long one. Scrolling up to the top. Ginny asks, in Maine, activists have worked for decades to convert BIW to other purposes. BIW is the
Bath Iron Works.
Bath Iron Works, thank you. To other purposes, and nothing has changed so far. What can we do to make an actual shift and employment opportunities here that are different from the military ones, to those that a shift to those that meet actual human needs, such as health, education, and housing?
It is very difficult, no doubt. And part of the issue, the plans for so-called defense conversion or peace conversion or economic conversion have been proposed since the 1970s. William Wimpesinger, who was a long time ago, may he rest in peace, one of the national co-chairs of Sane Freeze before Peace Action, he was the head of the Machinists Union. And he was all in favor, along with Seymour Melman and others, all in favor of the economic conversion. And their idea is that you involve the workers and the community and the management to come up with plans to convert. But absent either a federal mandate to do that or federal dollars being dangled for something other than weapons production, those companies and even a lot of those unions have been opposed, unfortunately. What Amy just put in the chat, offshore wind power development, my understanding is that's one of the things that people have tried to promote because they make the turbines for nuclear submarines. Well, that's the same technology for wind technology. The good news on this is that it's very different if you're talking about a company that has a profit from war and from weapons and that provides manufacturing jobs in the community. That is very hard, and there are not a lot of good examples of conversion. Actually, Northrop Grumman was a bad one at first anyway. The Grumman Flexible, they were buses that they tried to make that sort of failed at first. I think they fixed the problem. The good news, though, is that military bases have had a better conversion success stories. And if you look at particularly some of these places that we're talking about in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, converting those bases, once you clean up all the awful, toxic, horrible stuff from the military, because of course the military is the worst polluter in the world, there have been more success stories at converting bases than at converting companies. The companies, they've consolidated, and you're down to a handful of the largest military contractors, and then there's a bunch of smaller subcontractors. They're not going to change until they're forced to. I think people do have to get together if they can in their community and say, this is what we want instead. And particularly, this is instead what we would do if we had federal money to improve health and education, housing, et cetera, in our community. But it's a tough slog. There's no doubt about that.
Unfortunately, that is about all the time we've got. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us tonight and giving us all these updates. It was really, really great to hear from you and get a refresher on what we're diving into in the coming few months. I can't stress this enough to folks on the call. Do go to peaceaction.org, sign up for those e-alerts. There's no way that I can keep up with all of the legislation, and I probably miss about half of the things that National gets out for alerts, times that we need to be calling our reps to be sure that they're hearing from us. So do get to National Peace Action, peaceaction.org, sign up for those e-alerts, join National as well. Thanks again to Kevin. You can also learn more about us at peaceaction.org. This presentation will be on our website, so you can refer people to it if they need this information. This series will continue to be free and open to everyone. However, we always welcome your financial contributions through the website, NewHampshirePeaceAction.org/donate. And our next few conversations, 2 weeks from today, we have Andy Davis, whose presentation is Remaking the World One Story at a Time. He's a storyteller and one of the co-directors of the World Fellowship Center.
Yay,
2 weeks after
love
that,
him. I love Andy.
Yeah, he's fantastic. 2 weeks after that, Joel Berman, Scott Dickman, and Nancy Jo Shabbat will talk to us about Compassionate Listening Project in Alabama, where they talked about segregation and talked to the people who were on both sides of that struggle. 2 weeks after that, Bruce Gagnon will be talking to us about U.S.-Russia relations. So join us every other Monday, 7 p.m. Make sure you're signed up for our e-alerts so you can continue to hear about these. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you to everyone who came, and have a great night.
Peace, everyone. Thank you.